Good afternoon. Welcome to this EU-UK Forum discussion event. My name is Martin Westlake. I am a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges and at the European Institute at the London School of Economics, and I will be acting as the moderator today. Following the European Council's June decision to grant Ukraine and Moldova candidate status, the July beginning of accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia, and the European Commission's October recommendation that Bosnia and Herzegovina be granted candidate status, a growing number, 7, of European countries are now on the accession track, or like Georgia and Kosovo, are waiting in the wings. At the same time, the EU's difficult relations with the likes of Switzerland, Turkey, and the United Kingdom continue, as do rule of law issues with several current member states. In the light of all of this, we have brought together a panel of distinguished experts on the enlargement process and such emerging concepts as staged accession and the European political community to examine how the EU could or should be rethinking its neighbourhood. Our speakers today in alphabetical order. Dr. Rosa Balfour is Director of Carnegie Europe, an Associate Fellow of LSE Ideas, and a steering committee member of Women in International Security Brussels. She has published widely and is a frequent commentator on the European Union and international relations. A little earlier this year, Rosa published a Financial Times op-ed article with the title, "Europe Must Not Allow the Momentum for Expansion to Slip." The counterpoised subtitle read, "But the experience of North Macedonia does not bode well for Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine." The links to the publications that I will be flagging up of our participants today should be available to you and in the chat function as background reading, by the way. Professor Siglinde Gusteau is Director of the Department of EU International Relations and Diplomacy Studies at the College of Europe in Bruges. She has recently published, together with David Finnemore, a co-edited book entitled "The Proliferation of Privileged Partnerships Between the European Union and its Neighbours." And she has recently published an article, also co-authored with David Finnemore, entitled "The Future EU-UK Partnership, a Historical Institutionalist Perspective." Milena Lazarevic is a co-founder and the Programme Director of the European Policy Centre in Belgrade. But Milena joins us today not from Belgrade, but from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris, where she is attending another event today. We are very grateful to you, Milena, for double hatting in this way. Like all of our guest speakers, Milena has published prolifically on EU affairs, but what brings her to us in particular today is a policy paper jointly produced by the European Policy Centre in Belgrade and the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels, and co-authored by Milena, Michael Emerson, Stephen Blockmans, and Strahina Stotic, entitled "A Template for Staged Accession to the European Union." Sir Michael Leigh is currently Academic Director of the European Public Policy and Global Risk Master's Programmes at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna. Michael's distinguished academic activities have preceded and postceded, if that word exists, an equally distinguished career in the European Commission, where he served, among other senior positions, as Director General for Enlargement from 2006 to 2011. Michael has recently published 2 papers entitled respectively "New Approaches to EU Governance and Enlargement" and "Scenarios for European Union Enlargement." Pierre Vimont is currently a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe and a visiting professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, New York. During an illustrious 38 career with the French Foreign Service, Pierre served as French permanent representative to the European Union from 1999 to 2002, as French ambassador to the USA from 2007 to 2010, and he also served as chief of staff to 3 former French foreign ministers. He then finally served as the first executive secretary general of the European External Action Service from 2010 to 2015. Pierre recently published a comment piece for Encompass entitled "The European Political Community, Moving Ahead, but to Where?" As I said, all of these publications should be flagged up in background reading in the chat function. Welcome to all of my speakers today, and thank you for being with us. With no more ado, let me turn first to you, Michael. Could you please describe how the European Union got to where it is now and how its approach to the concept and the process of enlargement has evolved? Michael, you are muted. Michael, could you take your headset off? No, I think, Michael, whilst we leave you to contend with your technical issues, maybe we could turn to Sieglinde Gestol, if I could. Sieglinde, could I ask you to say a few words about what might be called the awkward squad of Switzerland with its complicated bilateral arrangements, Turkey with its customs union and de facto frozen candidate status, and the United Kingdom, which, as we were discussing before we went live, depending on who you read, is either deintegrated or disintegrated from the European Union. Over to you, Sieglinde.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation and for suggesting this topic. As you just said, Martin, the EU has very different relationships with these 3 countries, Switzerland, Turkey, and the UK. So Turkey is a candidate country, and since 1995 in a partial customs union with the EU, which was at the time seen as a stepping stone towards membership. So it wanted to join the EU, but was not able to since. And even the plan B of a modernization of the customs union is not moving ahead. Then Switzerland could join the European Union, but does not want to. It has concluded around 120 bilateral sectoral agreements with the EU, of which about 20 are major ones, and most of them are static in terms of requiring a revision to follow the development of EU rules in a sector. And never mind. So I was just talking about Turkey, now Switzerland, and I wanted to remind everybody that last year the Swiss government had actually refused to sign the negotiated institutional framework agreement, which would have made some of these bilateral sectoral agreements mentioned earlier more dynamic. And we also have to keep in mind that Switzerland actually rejected to join the European Economic Area Agreement in 1992. And finally, the UK, as you all know, is a former member state and now in a somewhat unambitious bilateral trade and cooperation agreement, the TCA, which is more inspired by the EU's FTAs with countries further away than close neighbors. And of course, this is a result of the British government's red lines. Now, so what do these 3 countries actually have in common? I would say, first of all 3 of them are closely integrated with the European Union and its internal market. They are among, for example, the top 10 trading partners of the EU. Second, their current relationships are considered somewhat unsatisfactory, and they have been looking for alternatives, since domestic factors obviously prevent them from full EU membership. And third, the EU's partnerships with close neighbors usually take the form of association agreements with varying requirements regarding the degree of homogeneity required, and thus also varying extents of taking over parts of the relevant acquis communautaire. Only the UK's TCA does not foresee the taking over of such a key or granting a role to the Court of Justice of the European Union, except for Northern Ireland. Hence, not all European neighbors of the EU want to join as full members. And here we might even add the other EFTA countries, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein. However, they already have an alternative in place since almost 30 years, the European Economic Area, or EEA. There has in fact been rather limited institutional innovation since the creation of the European Economic Area, which is generally considered as the benchmark model. Now, despite the different levels of ambition regarding the scope and the institutional governance arrangements, the EU's agreements with neighbors face similar challenges. I would say that a major challenge for the EU is safeguarding the homogeneity of its market and legal space, or if you're thinking of the UK, a level playing field. In fact, the EU's legal and political principles have remained unchanged since the late 1980s. So when it first embarked upon negotiations with the EFTA countries, which then led to the creation of the EEA. They concerned a priority of EU integration, especially over widening or other alternative relations. Second, the autonomy of EU decision-making and the legal order, and a balance of benefits and obligations. And the European Union has since repeatedly made clear, indeed, also in recent years, that the following institutional issues need to be addressed in deep neighborhood relations. First of all, how to keep agreements up to date in light of relevant new EU legal acts. Second, how to monitor compliance. Third, how to ensure the uniform interpretation of agreements in line with the acquis from which they have been derived. And fourth, how to settle disputes with partners. Now, a major challenge for the neighbors is to find an acceptable balance in the fundamental trade-off they are facing between the benefits resulting from participation in the internal market and beyond, and the related lack of real participation in the EU decision-making process. So I would say from a comparative perspective, we can actually observe that the governance arrangements tend to be stronger, the broader and deeper the substance covered in a partnership. In other words, the higher the degree of acquis-based integration, the more likely is an inclusion of third countries in the EU's decision-making process, albeit only at best via so-called decision shaping, meaning an early involvement in the making of new legal acts by contributing to proposals up until they are actually formally adopted. For example, participation in Commission expert groups. I think that such an inclusion to some extent compensates the country's relative loss of autonomy in return for their access and participation in the internal market. And then finally, I would say that a challenge for both sides, and this has become very clear with Brexit, are path dependence and precedents, which limit the bespoke models available. So what one neighbor might be granted by the EU, another neighbor might ask for too. And I think I will leave it there for the sake of time. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, dear Sigrinda. One suspects that the awkward squad would be less awkward if they weren't quite so important to the European Union in trading terms. Dear Michael, I think we can now turn to you. I think the problems have been resolved. Would you like to just say testing so that we can be certain? No, you've gone again. It's very strange. Michael, on our screen, we can see that you're muted. On your screen, there should be a sign désactiver le son on the left at the bottom.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely. Michael, well done. Congratulations. Welcome back to the Zoom age. The floor is yours.
Isn't technology absolutely wonderful when it works? Anyway, Martin, thanks very much for organizing this session and for inviting me. Let me just share a few sort of broad thoughts on how the enlargement process has evolved over the years, starting with the present. The Ukraine war has brought back geopolitics to the enlargement process, which some said had largely become a box-ticking exercise previously. Remember the 80,000 pages of acquis that the candidates had to adopt and implement during the fifth enlargement? There's still more today. Candidate status for Ukraine and Moldova, and EU perspective for Georgia, were meant to give a clear political message to Putin. We recognize no Russian sphere of influence in Europe, and a message of solidarity to the countries themselves. The granting of candidate status to these two countries was entirely politically motivated, despite the rapid due diligence for the Commission opinion. Absent the war, Ukraine and Moldova would have remained a bridge too far for EU enlargement for the indefinite future. But enlargement has always been a politically or geopolitically inspired process. In the country I used to know best, membership was meant to answer the famous Dean Acheson conundrum that Britain had lost an empire and not yet discovered a role. Enlargement in reverse, Brexit, was also politically motivated with little heed to the economic consequences. For many years, enlargement was described as the EU's most effective foreign policy. Enlargement was often said to be about exporting stability and not about importing instability. For Greece, Portugal, and Spain, accession was meant to stabilize democracy after the overthrow of their dictatorships. The fifth enlargement in 2004 and 2007 gave the EU a key role in unifying Europe after the collapse of communism. For Václav Havel, it meant Central Europe's return to Europe. All this gave the EU considerable élan. Enlargement was a major focus of the Delors and Prodi commissions, together with the single market and economic and monetary union, which of course raised the bar for future enlargements. Under Prodi, the enlargement portfolio was held by Günther Verheugen, a German commissioner who was close to the then chancellor and backed up strongly by the UK, among others. He was the one who persuaded member states to agree to the Big Bang or regatta enlargement of 2004. Enlargement to the Western Balkans, and of course to Turkey, has been far more problematic. The élan given by the EU's role in unifying Europe is gone. Large member states no longer fight for the enlargement portfolio, now merged with neighbourhood. The collapse of Yugoslavia and the dreadful wars that accompanied it added the goals of state building and post-war reconciliation to the process. This, alas, has proved elusive until the present day. The bar for membership has been raised higher still following democratic backsliding in several now not so new member states. We face competition from Russia and China in the Balkans, though Russia's reputation is now in free fall, even in Serbia, and China's investments threaten the environment and employ little local labor. The public in the EU has grown weary, despite the Balkans' location in their midst and the risk of tensions there spilling over. EU governments have never explained properly to citizens why they consider enlargement to be in the national and European interest. Balkan leaders use this as a pretext to avoid tackling corruption, state capture, and ethno-nationalist conflicts. Still, the recent recognition of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a candidate was meant to convey to the region that the Ukraine war has not put their applications on the back burner. Today's avowedly geopolitical approach is honest and refreshing, but it lands us with a problem: how to avoid disappointment in Ukraine and Moldova when people there grasp that the road to membership is indeed a very long one. In the Balkans, we've pretty much run out of interim benefits to provide incentives for reform. We need new ideas. These must involve, in one form or another, bringing applicant countries into EU initiatives and increasing financial support for them early on in the process, provided, of course, they get serious about better governance and rooting out corruption. New multilateral forums, like the still tentative European Political Community, may help, as long as they don't become a distraction, draining energy from the enlargement process itself. A final point. Chancellor Scholz has revived the old argument that reform of EU decision-making must precede enlargement, deepening before widening. This is well and good in principle, but 12 to 15 member states are firmly opposed to treaty change to get rid of the veto. For them, this would imply permanent subservience to Paris and or Berlin and perhaps other larger member states. Maintaining the Scholz line in the teeth of opposition from over half the EU's member states is another way of saying there will be no further enlargement on my watch, at least. I'm not really sure in today's geopolitical circumstances that this is the message we wish to convey. Today's panel is a great opportunity to discuss these challenges, and I'm very grateful to Paul and to you, Martin, for making it possible.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that excellent overview. You touch on a number of points that our subsequent speakers are going to deal with. You make a fundamental point about the fact that the acquis is ever growing, and so the challenge of accession is also ever growing. It's a fundamental conundrum that perhaps is less well known than it should be. Of course, as you said, the EU doesn't just have an awkward squad outside its frontiers, it also has one within, relatively recent member states accused of backsliding in various ways. At the same time, as you said, the EU has promised candidate status now to several more countries that, to put it mildly, still have a long way to go. Milena, could you please explain to us the concept of staged accession that you and your colleagues have developed, which, as I understand it, is a means both to maintain effective incentives to future member states, whilst also retaining reassuring safeguards for existing member states. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Martin, and I'm very happy to be able to be with you today, despite this conflict in the calendar. Yes, indeed, the staged accession proposal is exactly an attempt to offer a solution to this conundrum of how do we, on the one hand, provide incentives and boost political support for the difficult and sometimes politically painful reforms in the Western Balkan region, in the candidate countries, while at the same time unlocking the political will in the enlargement skeptic member states, the member states which are indeed concerned about the functioning of a further enlarged European Union, keeping in mind the difficulties which the EU already faces in coming to some important policy decisions, and especially in terms of agreeing on the future development and future reform of the EU itself. The reason why we decided to offer a model which is organized in several stages is precisely because we have observed over time that enlargement or accession and the EU integration process has lost political appeal in the region because, as one of the previous speakers, as Professor Leigh mentioned, we're running out of interim incentives. We have tried to actually, through these bundles of benefits organized within the stages, which come in response to achievement of a certain level of preparedness, and not least improving preparedness in the first negotiation cluster, which focuses on democracy, rule of law, so the basics of governance and functioning of a democratic state. To offer a credible process which brings new benefits for the citizens, but also for political representatives in the governments. And in that sense, the first two stages which we proposed in our model, which are basically the pre-accession stages, the stages of the pre-accession process, so leading up to the signing and ratification of the accession treaty. In these two stages, we offer increasing levels of institutional participation through firstly selective and then generalized observer status and speaking rights, of course, without voting rights in these pre-accession stages in various council formations, in various committees and various institutions of the EU, and at the same time increasing levels of financial support, which we know are badly needed to support the closing of the socioeconomic development gap between the region and the EU. The third and the fourth stages of the model are actually membership stages, and let's say the key innovation there is stage 3, which we call the new the new member state stage, in which a country, for example, let's take Serbia, has signed and ratified accession treaty, but this accession treaty is slightly different from the previous ones in the sense that it regulates two important aspects. One aspect is post-accession monitoring of fundamental areas of reform, basically the values which are enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty of the EU, and let's say a credible process or a credible mechanism for reversing certain membership rights without, of course, expelling this new member state from the EU, but freezing certain membership rights in case of serious backsliding, which is shown through this monitoring process. So we have taken some examples from the verification and cooperation mechanism for Bulgaria and Romania, but improved and actually built for the purpose of monitoring new member states' democratic performance and value performance within the EU in a period of, let's say, 10 to 15 years. In the same period, new member states would also have slightly limited rights as member states, in the sense that they would not get to impose their veto. They would not be able to use veto powers in decision-making in the EU. Now, whether that would be a generalized limitation or it would be made specific for specific policy areas, this is yet to be developed, and we are still working on refining this model and defining all the details. This is in the making. But in any case, the idea would be, in fact, with this third stage, to offer the EU sort of a safety period in which it can continue its internal reforms, come to an agreement on how the EU would be functioning in the enlarged format, without actually keeping the candidate countries outside and in front of the door while it is getting its house in order. So we are actually saying that the Western Balkans should be let inside. They should be let as participants in the policy making, in the single market, in the EU's policies. And they should be able to participate in the creation of new policies without being able to block further development of the EU. But we really truly believe that the challenges with which the Western Balkans face are very similar to the ones that EU member states face, both in terms of democracy, rule of law, but also all other difficulties currently facing the EU, and that the Western Balkans would be much better able to not only solve these problems, but also contribute to solving these problems at the EU level if it is let inside as a constructive actor than if it is let outside. These limitations would be stipulated in the accession treaty for a limited period of time, as any other derogations which have existed in all previous enlargements. Once these temporary derogations, as I said, let's say 10 to 15 years elapse, new member state becomes a conventional member state just like any other. And of course, if the EU doesn't use these additional 10 to 15 years that it would get in a way from the candidate countries, from the new member states, to put its house in order, to find ways to improve decision making, to improve safeguards for the basic values enshrined in Article 2, then it would get potential additional troublemakers, just like any other member state. But we believe that, giving the EU this time, this additional time, 10 to 15 years, would actually also create a positive pressure on the member states to make it their business to put the house in order. So I will stop here. The proposal is quite elaborate, so we have really missed out on a lot of details. As I said, we're still developing a series of papers which will be published in the course of the next 7 to 8 months. And I invite all of you to follow our work and to follow the further development of this model.
Many thanks, Milena. I indeed do commend the policy paper to everybody. As I understand it, Milena, it's not really intended as a hard and fast blueprint, but a first serious stab at what some sort of graduated accession process could look like. And so it's well worth a read. Rosa, if I could turn next to you, could you tell us, please, about the European Council's June decision to grant Ukraine and Moldova candidate status and to offer a membership perspective to Georgia? What are the ramifications of this decision? And if I wrote this back into the Financial Times op-ed I mentioned earlier, what does the Western Balkans experience to date suggest in this context?
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for inviting me to contribute to this discussion, which is really critical. It's really important. This is the future of Europe is at stake in Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's taking place on Ukrainian territory, and it is vital that the EU rises to the occasion, and that the reasons for rising to the occasion and for responding in a certain way are effectively communicated. From my point of view, there was very little alternative to offering candidate status to Ukraine, and Moldova, and potentially to Georgia. This is a long-standing request coming from these countries. The EU has always evaded the question and has designed policies which, eventually coalesced in the Eastern Partnership Initiative, policies that offered a gradual integration into the European market, into European policies, but without the accession. I mean, once upon a time, when this was initially launched back in 2003, in the context of the previous big enlargement of 2004, it was called, Romano Prodi was the president of the European Commission and said everything but institutions. That's not exactly what the Eastern Partnership was about, but that was the best that the EU could offer at the time in the face of persisting demands from these countries to have a prospect to join. At the time when Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia applied in the spring, Ukraine, the conflict was at a point whereby Ukraine had declared that it was willing to give up on NATO membership, which is another long-standing request. It was willing to embrace a policy of neutrality with security assurances from NATO and from the US, from NATO member states, and not from Russia, but also that membership to the EU was something it was aiming for. And there was no actual opposition from Russia, so that seemed to be a path that needed to be followed. And of course, the response was positive, and of course, the response meant skipping all those stages that Michael referred to at the very beginning. And there was a crash course, shall we say, in the process in order to be granted candidate status. However, as has been remarked, we also have another enlargement process ongoing, stagnating under, I think, from any point of view, that's a sort of sober assessment of what's been happening in the relationship between the EU and the Western Balkans. And at the very beginning, there was a bit of a risk that these two processes would start to be in competition with each other. Whereas I think it's absolutely critical to focus on the linkages and to think creatively about how the accession process, which is already ongoing with the Western Balkan countries, and this new accession process, when it actually begins to become, a policy reality, and that's not the case yet, that these two processes are actually mutually reinforcing and serving the overarching goal of protecting the democracy and sovereignty of European states and of the European Union. So it's really important to look at the interactions between the two, both because the stagnation in the Western Balkans could put off political reform in Ukraine and Moldova, and because it would, if the process is not revived and renewed in a successful way, then Europe risks losing what has been historically its most successful foreign policy tool, which is precisely enlargement. Now, what to do about it? Milena has, highlighted this staged accession process. There are quite a few ideas about how to revive the process, and I don't really want to talk much about that precisely because Milena has done it, but just maybe look at two other dimensions. One is politics in Europe, and the other is politics in the Western Balkans. And of course, we need to think about the political situation in Ukraine and Moldova. If we want to understand why enlargement hasn't been functioning, one of the reasons is fatigue in the EU member states, and that's why it's really important to better communicate how why accession is why enlargement and why this commitment made towards Ukraine and Moldova, potentially Georgia, is so important. But if you look at the interaction, I think the single most important reason for the stalling of enlargement has been the inability of and unwillingness of the EU political leadership to truly engage with the political leadership in the countries that want to join. And we have seen vicious processes rather than virtuous processes whereby de facto EU leadership allows democratic backsliding to take place in the region. The more this happens, the further away these countries go from joining the European Union. So what's important, we have a geopolitical logic which has been driving the choices made, but it really needs to be accompanied by policies and a commitment towards democratic transformation. And this is valid for the Western Balkans because that is the prime reason for which the process has been stagnating there, but it will also be valid in Ukraine and Moldova. Now, let's zoom back to, switch back to Ukraine in particular, which of course is in a state of war, and it is very limited what we can expect in terms of reform at this point in time. However, we are already beginning to talk about reconstruction of Ukraine, and I think it will be critical to try and marry the policies and approaches that will drive the international effort for the reconstruction of Ukraine with the preparation for joining the European Union. Therefore, we need to look at anti-corruption, transparency, procurement rules, the role of foreign direct investments, infrastructure, reconstruction. These will all be key areas which, where work will start early and around which one could start also introducing the first policies that will become what will be the new accession process. I'd just like to say one final word about this. So just to sum up, we have a geopolitical logic. It needs to be accompanied by a strong policy which focuses on democratic and political reform. These two need to go hand in hand. It is critical, I think, to make sure that what happens in the Western Balkans is reinforced and reinforcing with what happens in Moldova and Ukraine. And de facto at this moment, this is the international community's policy, long-term policy, because otherwise we're moving in a context of conflict in which it is, at the moment, we're not seeing the end of this conflict. We're not seeing the shape of the end of this conflict. And therefore, it's absolutely important to have a vision that can drive the day-to-day grind of responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I'll leave it there.
Many thanks, Rosa, because the French would say, un travail à longue haleine. Pierre, there have been several proposals in the recent past for some sort of overarching European organization that would provide a sort of a new space for cooperation. We've had Enrico Letta's proposal for a 36-state European federation. That's a former Italian prime minister. We've had Alexander Stubb's call for a multi-tiered Europe. That's a former Finnish prime minister. And Charles Michel's similar call for a broader common framework for dialogue. That's a former Belgian prime minister. But the one idea that in the end materialized was Emmanuel Macron's proposal for a European political community, which had its first meeting in Prague last month, bringing together 44 states. And as I understand it, is scheduled to have its next meeting in Chisinau in Moldova this coming spring. Could you tell us, please, Pierre, about this new kid on the block and what sort of role you think it might play?
With pleasure, Martin. I apologize, there's a little bit of noise above my head, but I hope it will recede quickly. Thanks for inviting me. Great to see Rosa, who happens to be my boss at Carnegie, and others, other familiar faces. You're asking me about the European political community. In fact, it has come a bit as a surprise that this French idea, which was more or less a new attempt at doing what François Mitterrand did about in 1990 with this European Confederation, it came a bit of a surprise that this new idea by Emmanuel Macron has been more successful. This idea of simply reuniting and gathering in one format all member states, candidate countries, members of the EFTA coalition, West Balkan countries candidate to the European Union, and the members of the Eastern Partnership. This was something that looked like an impossible task. And surprisingly, the meeting in Prague went well. It went well because there was, first of all, this simple idea that a concept launched in May was implemented in October, which was something really surprising compared to the failed attempt of François Mitterrand, who took more than 1 year to gather everybody in Prague. 44 European states that gathered together and were rather pleased with the way the meeting went on. Interesting bilateral conversation, some breakthrough here and there between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and more than anything else, a well-organized meeting by the Czech presidency, which showed that such a huge gathering could unfold in a rather successful way. Then, good result, a roadmap, a rotating system between EU member states and non-EU member states, which also gives us now a plan to go ahead. Then the question is, why was it successful? And why did we manage this time to get everybody around the table and to have this event being rather a success? I think there are several reasons to that. The first one, I would say, is that the usual suspects manage to stay in a sort of low-profile attitude. I'm thinking about the French government. Naturally, the one leader of this event, because they are the ones who came up with the idea, and therefore the ones that were supposed to be all over the place during this meeting. And they were not. Emmanuel Macron was rather discreet and understood right from the beginning that it was better to let everyone move along freely and speak as they wish. Second usual suspect, the EU institutions, and I think Michael would not contradict me on that one. Every time a new train moves out from the station in the European continent, Brussels likes to take the lead and to control the whole thing. Or there was also an agreement between the French and the EU institution to let this process unfold in its own way and not to try by all means to control it. And I think that was rather interesting. Second feature, in my opinion, equal footing between all the 24 member states, the 24 states invited there. Precisely no difference between the EU member states and the other, with no one trying to lead at all cost. And I think that was a major difference. Thirdly, this meeting had no connection with the enlargement process. And I think that was also very important. The fact that, as mentioned by Rosa and Michael, an agreement had already been reached in giving the status of candidate country to Ukraine and Moldova, and maybe later to Georgia, was very helpful in putting aside this whole question of how do the enlargement process and the European political community are linked. They are not so far, and a lot of people hope it will stay that way, and I think it could be. Another feature was the fact that there was a sort of rallying call with this meeting, which was all about the Ukrainian war and how to resist to the Russian invasion. That was also very important, in my opinion. And lastly, there was one big elephant in the room that no one mentioned, and that was all very well, which was the United States. You remember certainly that one of the reasons why the Mitterrand's initiative in 1990 failed, it was because precisely it obviously did everything to keep the US aside. Here, interestingly enough, the question was not raised, and therefore I think this also helped for the meeting to go ahead in that smooth way. Third point, and I will end with this, Martin, is where do we go from here? First, as I told you before, there is a plan, and therefore the next meeting will be Moldova, probably by the end of the next semester. We need time to think about this. And I think that gives already a good horizon, a good setting, a good goal for the months ahead. But the second question, of course, is what are we going to do with this European political community? I think the first answer for that would be, for the time being, keep it as it is. Some people have been complaining that this was mostly a talking shop, a very informal format with no clear operational outcome. But I think this is also one of the reasons why it was successful. All those 44 partners meeting in Prague had a huge need to speak to each other and to understand each other a little bit better. And that was the main purpose of the meeting. And if need be, if they still need to discuss a little bit more between themselves, then leave it that way. There are so many differences in terms of historical heritage, geographical positioning, difference of political culture, that a little better understanding of where everyone stands could be a very useful way of moving forward towards more integration. Then we can look at the operational side. There has been already many items put on the table in Prague, from energy security to transport infrastructure, migration, education, so on and so forth. We have time to look at all this and to start to settle and to set up some of these projects. For the time being, after all, let's keep talking. That is very useful. And this is, in my opinion, one of the first formats where this can be done in such a free and informal way. So let's not lose that added value that the European political community has brought inside the whole framework of the European continent. I'll stop there, Martin.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for that excellent and optimistic oversight, really, of developments with the European political community. Today, we've adopted the Miles van der Rohe less is more approach to the webinar. We have very little time left for questions and answers, and I've promised to be quite ruthless because several of our panel members have to go on to other activities at 4 on the dot. So I'm going to, if I may, I'm going to take a couple of questions. One is a question, the other is a statement. The statement answers the question in a sense. So we have Ray Bryant, a town planner, who asks, whilst it's well to integrate as many countries as possible into the EU, will the supranational body ultimately suffer in terms of decision-making effectiveness? And we have Richard Corbett, distinguished former leader of the European Parliamentary Labour Party, advisor to Herman van Rompuy and to Klaus Welle, the Secretary General of the European Parliament, who argues that reaching 30+ member states while retaining unanimity requirements is a recipe for future paralysis of the EU. Those that reject any reform of this, which could be done by using the passerelle clauses rather than a full treaty revision procedure, are the ones who are effectively sabotaging the process and not Olaf Scholz. And the claim that QMV means a Brussels dictatorship is nonsense. QMV is a high threshold, a double majority of 2/3 by population, and a majority of all 6 states. So Ray, if we get those reforms, your question will be answered. In the little time that we have left, there is a question from Andreas Herdina, who's a retired official of the European Commission, former director. He says, I was recently told that Ukrainian MPs welcome the reform pressure that EU candidate status entails. From my experience working for EU enlargement and speaking recently to former Lithuanian negotiating partners, I believe that the reform process is more important than a swift arrival at accession, as long as reform is tangible. Now, Milena, you have bagged that question. So over to you. If you could keep your answer short, please, then maybe we will have time for one more question.
Yes, I will be very short. I just wanted to explain that from the Western Balkans experience, this power of the process is only as strong as the credibility of the process itself in terms of leading to the finalité, leading to the actual EU membership. And one of the reasons that the EU accession process has lost its transformative power for the states, for the governments in the region, is exactly because it has become an open-ended process with no clear end in sight. So as long as we can have a process which delivers in terms of the actual integration and has a clear end in sight in terms of actual membership, I really do agree that the actual experience of the process is extremely valuable. But the process will not be as transformative and as powerful if, and it will not have the same effect if the promise of membership is not real and is not credible, if it's not believed by the political elites, by the people, all involved.
Thank you very much, Milena, for being so respectful of the time limit. We have another question from Mark English, who is now a policy advisor to the European movement in the UK and a former European Commission official. He asks, might staged reaccession be available to the UK in who knows when years' time? And in a sense, we have been nibbling around the edges of the UK's future role, wherever it is in the European political community, in some sort of version of staged deaccession and so on. Siglinda, you bagged this question, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, in principle, yes. I mean, the TCA is open to build up further cooperation. It has a governance aspect built in for that purpose. So there could be, of course, more cooperation / integration in the future. But the question is always, what does the British government want? I mean, if you think of back on the red lines that have been put forward during the negotiations and the famous or infamous slide by Michel Barnier with the staircase, I mean, it all comes back to that. And also what I said before, we are talking here about external differentiated integration. And if a third country wants to participate in the internal market, it comes at a price. The closer you integrate, the more you have to accept that there are also limits when it comes to institutional questions. I think to find that balance is really the task that every country has to figure out in terms of national preferences. What can they accept? What can they not accept? And I also had, maybe as a last remark, a little bit of a déjà vu here. I mean, all these models that we were discussing, from the EPC to staged accession, we have seen them, we have discussed them in various forms and shapes in the 1990s already, in the debate that was referred to, I think, by Martin and Pierre as well, and Michael, about this deepening versus widening. So I think it all comes down to this external differentiation and integration, and what each country wants and what the EU can offer.
Many thanks, Sieglinde. Milena is apologising. The French organisers of the conference have called her in already, so she's going to dash away. We have one last question. Pierre, if you can answer it in two minutes max. Bill Roger, who is Treasurer of the European Movement in Scotland, asks, what lessons can we draw regarding the veto qualified majority voting issue from the success of the egalitarian approach to the European Political Committee meeting? If we've got time, maybe, Michael, you would like to dash in as well. Pierre?
I think, to be honest, and responding as quickly as possible, that the reason why people being on an equal footing worked well was that precisely the conference itself had no operational purpose at this stage. And therefore, for everybody to be there and that there was unanimity and consensus made no difference at all, because even at the end, there was no communique, no final statement on which there was need to do drafting. And that could have been really difficult. As the organizers knew very well, it was better to stay out of that kind of situation. So it seems to me that the whole issue of veto or qualified majority doesn't really apply, at least at this stage, with the European political community.
Michael, approaching things from the other end?
On the QMV question, Martin,
yes, yeah.
I think the arguments in favor of shifting to QMV, which is the usual rule for decision-making in the EU, to areas where it does not apply today, some foreign policy aspects, taxation, budget, sanctions, and so on, in an ideal world is highly desirable. But for the time being, 15 member states are on record that they don't think that treaty change in this direction is the most urgent thing, with a war going on and other priorities. So by making this a precondition at this stage, I'm afraid that we are mortgaging the enlargement process, however strong the arguments might be in principle.
Wow, sobering observations. Well, unfortunately, we are rapidly approaching the end of our allotted hour. Personally, I have learned a huge amount. I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart our 5 guest speakers today, Rosa Balfour, Sieglinde Gustel, Milena Lazarevic, Michael Leigh, and Pierre Vimont. Thank you, all of you, for having brought such a rich mix of experience and expertise to this discussion. In the second place, I would like to thank the EU-UK Forum for having hosted the webinar, and particularly its founder chairman, Paul Adamson, for having invited me to put together and moderate today's panel. I would also, it's been a pleasure and a privilege. I'd also like to thank Joe Knott for having made all of this possible from a technical point of view. Last but not least, I would like to thank you, the audience, for having been with us for this past hour and for your questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to them all, but our guests had a fair stab at quite a few. I won't pretend that it's possible to summarize succinctly all that we have heard today, but what is clear is that EU enlargement is back on the agenda. What form it will take and how that process will be managed remain to be seen, but the insights and ideas our guest speakers have shared with us today will certainly help in rethinking the European Union's neighbourhood. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.